Good morning and welcome for today's lecture. Today we will be starting chapter 4. We're going a little bit of backward to talk about an introduction to traffic control devices. Basically, this chapter we're gonna try to get to know more about the manual of uniform traffic control devices. Also, we're gonna talk about three major elements as a traffic engineers and how can we interact with drivers. We're gonna talk about traffic markings, traffic signs, all the way to traffic signals. So, as we all know, every traffic law must be communicated through the use of three broad traffic control devices. So this is again the way we talk to drivers, the way we interact with drivers, as well as even pedestrians, is through traffic marking, traffic signs, and traffic signals. Let's start with the traffic markings first. So the major and principal standard that we typically use as traffic engineers to design markings, signs, and signals is the Manual on Uniform Traffic Control Devices, MUTCD. It's basically published by the Federal Highway Administration, FHWA, and it serves as a minimum standard and a model for individual state MUTCDs, because every state it has its own version of the MUTCD where it handles most of the federal regulations as well as some of the local regulations as well. Many states simply adopt this federal manual, while others develop their own, but again, they need to make sure that they are implementing the federal standards as well as adding their own local standards. The major objective for this manual is really we're trying here to establish a uniformity in the use and placement of the design of traffic control devices. So if you are in Texas, if you are in California, if you are using the same MUTCD, we're trying here really to have somehow uniform use and placement and design for those traffic devices, so that if you're driving let's say from Texas all the way to California, as a driver you will be interacting with those traffic control devices and you wouldn't see a major difference while you're driving through different states. The general principles for the MUTCD, it always indicate that the traffic control device has to satisfy several aspects. The very first one, it has to fulfill the need. So for example, a stop sign, it's a sign and it has to fulfill the need that has to deliver the message that the driver has to stop once he or she reach that intersection. It also have to command an attention. It has to be big enough, the font has to be big enough, the color has to indicate something to command attention of the driver. It also has to convey a clear and simple message. I cannot have sentences and 10 sentences expecting that the driver would be reading the sign with lots of letters and lots of words. It has to be very concise, to the point, very simple, easy to read. It also has to command respect of road users. What does that mean? Meaning sometimes again we have to put that if you are speeding, you are gonna pay several certain amount of fine. So the fine or the fee or the ticket has to, we can show it. Sometimes again you would be driving and you would see that speeding would cost you again $200 per ticket if you are speeding, something like this. And also it has to give an adequate time for a proper response. So if I'm approaching a signal in a very rural road and I'm not used to see a signal that frequent, then there must be a sign that tells the driver that there is a signal, for example, in 1,000 feet. Or if you are approaching a fork at a highway and now it's either you take highway A or highway B, then there must be a sign in advance tell the driver that you are about to select one out of two highways. So again, it needs to give that adequate time for a proper response from the driver. So what are the contents of the MUTCD? MUTCD try to address three critical aspects of of traffic control devices. The very first one, the MUTCD as a manual, is really give a good detailed standards for the physical design of the device, specifying the shape, the size, the color, the legend types and sizes, and specific legends as well. So here pretty much everything has to do with the physical design of the device, and that device again can be a sign or a traffic signal or a marking. So it gives the shape. For example, again, if it's a stop sign, it gives exactly the size, the color, the font size, everything that has to do with the physical design. But not even that only. Also, the MUTCD gives a detailed standard and guidelines on where devices should be located with respect to the traveled way. Because you may have the best traffic sign or traffic marking, but you're not putting it at the right location. Or the location is right, but it's been hidden by another object on the street, like what we're gonna see in a second in this picture here. So again, it gives us that standard where to put it. And also, MUTCD provides us with warrants or conditions that justify the use of a particular device. For example, having a traffic signal, the MUTCD, we're gonna learn that it shows us that there are several conditions to govern a usage of traffic signal. I cannot use a traffic signal at every single intersection. There must be some conditions. If we get it satisfied, then we can place a traffic signal at that location. So those are the major, again, three critical aspects that MUTCD try to cover when it comes to traffic control devices. Let's have again a quick look at this example here. You see now, you can barely see here, there is a stop sign placed at the prescribed height, and lateral offset at the stop line winds up virtually hidden by a tree. So you could see here that the stop sign can be exactly at the exact location, designed very well, but again the tree now has been in front of it, and as a driver you won't be able to see the stop sign from a clear distance. So we always tell traffic engineers common sense must be also exercised in such cases if the device is to be effective. Because again, you may have the best design and you put it exactly the same place, the right place with the justification, but then you also have to use common sense to see, is it really going to be visible for drivers by the time they are approaching the intersection or not. So some of the legal aspects when it comes to the MUTCD, there are four different categories here. The language that MUTCD is using. The very first level is a standard. Standard basically is a statement of a required, mandatory, or specifically prohibitive practice regarding a traffic control device. So here again, this is the first level, the most firm level in the MUTCD. It's a standard, must be followed, required, and it's mandatory. The second level is a guidance. Guidance is simply a statement of recommended but not mandatory practice in typical situations. In fact, the deviations are allowed when it comes to guidance based on engineering judgment. So again, this is the second level. It's really recommended, but it's not mandatory, and it depends on the engineering judgment. The third level of the legal aspect of the MUTCD is an option. Option is a statement of practice that is permissive condition. In fact, it carries no implication of requirement or recommendation, just an option. The fourth level would be a support. Support is a purely information statement provided to supply additional information to the traffic engineer. So this again, support, less and less importance, and it's just given information to supply an additional information to the traffic engineer, not much. So we go from standard, which is mandatory, to less abiding words, which is guidance, all the way to option, and support. So how can we communicate with the driver? As the traffic engineers, we try to design our traffic signals, markings, and signage to communicate with the driver. So the driver is typically accustomed to receiving certain message in a clear and standard fashion, often with redundancy. When I say redundancy, again, drivers are typically they see the same signal or signage repeated, especially on the highways, to get the same message and to get the message clear. So the messages are typically conveyed through the use of these following elements. The way we interact with drivers: through color, through shape, through pattern, and legend. So color, again, we're gonna talk about it in more details in the next slides, but a color also is used. For example, a stop sign is a red. We used red. That means, again, something is really serious here, versus other colors. So color is the most famous element that we interact with drivers. Then shape. Again, shape of the stop sign is different than a speed limit, so shape also would give an indication to the driver. Then pattern, then legend. So the legend is the last element to comprehend. In fact, signals and markings, for example, convey their entire message through use of color, shape, and pattern only, while signs often use a specific legend to transmit the details of the message being transmitted. So the legend here must be kept simple and short. Otherwise, again, it's not gonna convey its message. So traffic markings fall into three broad categories. Now we're moving to start to talk about traffic markings. Traffic markings, we have longitudinal marking, we have transverse marking, and we have object markers and delineators. So traffic markings, the very first one is the longitudinal and transverse markings. So longitudinal and transverse markings are applied to the roadway surface using a variety of materials. So those are the marking on the road. We typically use two types of materials, either paint and thermoplastic, which are most commonly used. So we just go to the field, to the road, and we paint it. Or the more updated way of using traffic marking materials is by using reflectorization. Reflectorization, for a better night vision, is achieved by mixing tiny glass beads in the paint. So basically it's a mix between paint and glass beads, or we can actually apply a thin layer of glass beads over the wet pavement marking as it is placed. So, and again, this has been used heavily recently, but that doesn't mean it's still not common. The most common way is just going to the road and start painting the road with whatever marking we need to have. While the newer methodology is by using those tiny glass beads with the paint. Object markers and delineators are actually small object mounted reflectors. So here again we're having two major devices under the traffic markings. We either have longitudinal and transverse marking, which are applied on the roadway surface itself, or the object markers and delineators, which are small objects mounted reflectors. Those are small reflectors mounted on lightweight posts. They are typically used as roadside markers to help drivers in proper positioning during inclement weather when standard markings are not visible. So here what we're trying to say is that sometimes the marking that we have on the roads, if it's snowy or if we have ice or if there is fog, typically we have a hard time to read and see those longitudinal or transverse marking on the roadway itself, and therefore we use those object markers that they are on the side of the street to use them again as a guidance in case of inclement weather when standard markings are not really visible. How about the colors of the markings? So the color and pattern. So there are 5 marking colors that we typically use as traffic engineers while we're designing our traffic markings. The first color is yellow. So the yellow color typically used to separate traffic traveling in opposite directions. So between two opposite directions, you would see a line. Whether this line is continuous or dashed or dotted, we're gonna talk about it later. But for now, the yellow is used typically to separate traffic traveling in opposite directions. White color, though, it's used to separate traffic traveling in the same direction, and typically they are used for all transverse markings as well. So longitudinal markings when it comes to lanes in the same direction, and even when it comes to any transverse markings such as pedestrian markings, for example, we use white color in most of the cases. We also use red color in traffic markings to delineate roadways that will not be entered or used by the viewer of the marking. So that is also used to tell again it's not a place to go in, or maybe it's the wrong way. We also use blue used to delineate parking spaces reserved for persons with disabilities. In so many cases, when you go to any an office or a hospital or any business, you would see several parking spots painted with blue. So again, this is considered to be a traffic marking, indicating for the drivers that this is for disabled parking spots, it's not for a regular person. While the fifth color is black. Black is typically not really used as it is, it's used as a conjunction with other markings on light pavements. We use it typically to emphasize the pattern of the line or gaps between yellow or white markings are filled in with black to provide contrast and easier visibility. So it's really a tool rather than we are using it to deliver certain message. We use it to make the other colors look very brighter and deliver the message more clear. So again, we use it to emphasize the pattern of the line or gaps between yellow or white markings. Besides the color that we use again to give a message to the drivers, we also use patterns. So a solid line, for example, prohibits or discourages crossing. So if I have a yellow solid line, that means again I cannot cross that line. Or even a white color between two lanes in the same direction would tell a message to the driver that you cannot cross or you cannot change lanes at that location of the highway, for example. While a double solid line indicates a maximum or even special restriction. So that's also used in so many cases to deliver the message that it's really here a big deal that you cannot cross that line. While a broken line indicates that crossing is permissible. So in so many cases we see broken lines or the dotted line more than continuous or solid lines to indicate that it's allowed to shift lanes or change lanes, or in some cases in some rural highways where you do not have a chance to surpass a slower driver in front of you, where sometimes again you just have one lane per direction. In some spots where you have enough sight distance, then the yellow line would turn from solid to broken line to indicate for the driver that they can speed up a little bit and go to the other direction of the road and surpass the driver in front of them and get back to the right direction. So that's a broken line. A dotted line uses shorter line segments than a broken line, but again most of the time they are using the same or deliver the same message. Line markings are typically 4 to 6 inches wide, while broken lines normally consist of 10 feet line segments, then 30 feet gaps. So this is here the standard. So for broken lines normally consist of 10 feet line segment and then 30 feet gaps. and the MUTCD typically suggests the maximum segment to gap ratio of 1 to 3 for dotted lines. So the dotted line, again, we use that ratio 1 to 3 as a segment to gap ratio. When it comes to longitudinal markings, those are parallel to the direction of the travel. They typically involve center lines, lane lines, pavement edge lines, and we use them to provide organized flow and optimal use of the pavement width. So in so many cases, again, for newly paved roads, drivers would have a hard time to shift between a lane or the other, or they get close to the edge or the shoulder of the highway simply because the longitudinal markings are not there yet. So once we have those established, the driver now are gonna have an organized flow and optimal use of the pavement width. So when it comes to the longitudinal marking and the usage of the center lines, we use yellow center line in order to separate traffic traveling in opposite directions. And when it comes to those yellow center lines, we use double solid yellow center marking to indicate that passing is not permitted in either direction, or we can use a solid line with a dashed yellow line. So sometimes while you're traveling, you would see two lines. Both of them can be solid, or one can be solid with a dashed yellow line to indicate that passing is permitted for the dashed side only. So where passing is permissible in both directions, a single dashed yellow center line is used. So here we are having three different conditions, or three different locations. One, when it comes to the yellow line again separating traffic directions, but we can have double solid line indicating that you cannot pass or passing is not permitted in either direction. A solid line with a dashed line, it indicates the driver can pass if they are at the side of the dashed line only, or you can have just simply a dashed single yellow line indicating that surpassing or passing in both directions is allowed. And here in this picture you could see, so the first one here is the case is reversible lane markings. So here we're having three lanes, as you could see. One lane is going to this direction, one going to the opposite direction, while the middle lane, it can be either or. And this is again the passing or the surpassing lane. And the second picture here shows two-way left turn lane marking. So again, we're having here two lanes going left, two lanes going right, and we're having a lane in the middle serve as a left turn that is used for the two directions. You can turn left for the cars going to the right, or also can turn left for the cars going to the left. Also, under the longitudinal markings, we have, when it comes to lane markings, now we can talk about the white color. So we're done with the yellow color, which separate different directions. Now we're using a single white line. A single white line marking, it can be also continuous and it can be dashed. So a single white dashed line separating lanes of traffic in the same direction. In fact, MUTCD requires the use of lane markings on all highways, and interstate highways are recommended. They are used for all highways. So when it comes to freeways, it's required, while when it comes to interstate highways, it's recommended. And I hope now you appreciate the fact when it comes to required versus recommended. So MUTCD again require the use of lane marking on all freeways and interstate highways, and recommend their use on all highways. So it's a must for freeways and interstates, while it's recommended for other highway systems. A dashed lane line indicates that lane changing is permitted, while a single solid white line is used to indicate that the lane changing is discouraged but not illegal. So when you see a continuous white line, that tells you that it's not really recommended to change lanes, but it's not legal. When does this become illegal? Where lane changing is not is prohibited, when you see a double white solid lane line is used. So once we have two solid white lines, then this is where you cannot be legally changing lanes in the same we cannot change lanes in the same time. Edge marking, so those are lane markings. So lane markings can be white between lanes in the same direction, or can be yellow between opposite directions. Edge markings require standards on freeways, expressways, and rural highways with a traveled way of 20 feet or more in width and average daily traffic of 6,000 vehicles per day or greater. So you see now we're starting to see that MUTCD is putting requirements, which is a must for wide highways with lots of traffic. ADT is more than 6,000 vehicles per day, while this requirement drops now to a recommendation for rural highways with ADTs over 3,000 vehicles per day and 20 feet or wider traveled way. So one more time, the edge marking, again, it's a required standard for freeways, expressways, rural highways for wide highways that they are more than 20 feet in width and high ADT more than 6,000 vehicles per day, while it's just a recommendation for rural highways with ADT over 3,000 vehicles per day and 20 feet or wider traveled way. Now let's shift gears to transverse marking. So transverse marking, now they are 90 degrees to the driving direction. They include all marking that cuts across a portion or all of the traveled way. All transverse marking are white. We don't see any other color when we are using any transverse marking. Some of the famous transverse marking are the stop and yield lines. They are not really mandated by the MUTCD, but they are used where marked crosswalks exist and when stop sign or traffic signal is not clear. Stop lines also, on the other hand, shall not be used in conjunction with yield sign because it's going to be confusing. So it's either or. As you can see here in this picture, this is here the design of the yield or stop lines. Again, they are not mandated, and typically they are used for instead of a stop sign or a traffic signal. This is here the dimensions. For the minimum dimensions, it has to be this side is 12 inches, while the height is 18, while the maximum dimensions is 24 inches as the base of this triangle, and the height is 36 inches. This is here another example of crosswalk markings. It's not mandated again by MUTCD, but it's really recommended that crosswalks be marked at all intersections at which substantial conflict between vehicles and pedestrians exist. So here again, it really depends on the amount of pedestrians observed at that intersection and the amount of traffic as well. And that's why MUTCD cannot mandate it, or it cannot have it as a standard, which is a must. It's really recommended when the observed amount of pedestrian is higher, and therefore the interaction or the expected interaction between pedestrian and drivers are going to be higher, and therefore we typically put those markings. And again, there's several ways and several styles of crosswalk markings, but they have to be implemented at this location. We also use transverse markings as parking space markings. So in the MUTCD, they are always optional, but it's a good practice to have transverse marking where you are really drawing all the parking, and it's used to encourage efficient use of parking spaces. If you are giving the driver a marked parking space, that means they know exactly where to park their cars, and therefore we're gonna have more efficient space to fit more cars. While if it's not marked, then it's gonna be up to the drivers to park wherever they want, and therefore the amount of cars parking at the same location would be expected to be less. Also, under the traffic markings, we have object markings. Object markings, they are used to denote obstructions either in or adjacent to the traveled way. So we have several types of those object markings. They are very useful. For example, here type 1, those are object markings to show obstructions within the roadway. Type 2, object markings to show obstructions adjacent to the roadway. And also having type 3, which are object markings that show obstructions adjacent or within the roadway, all the way to the type 4, which is those to show you the end of the roadway. So they are very important, and we typically use them in so many cases. Under traffic markings, we also use delineators. Delineators are reflective devices that they are typically mounted at a 4 feet height on the sides of the roadway in order to help denote its alignment. So they are very useful during inclement weather when the pavement edge marking may not be visible. In so many cases, again, if it's a snowy condition, we don't know where's the road exactly, so those delineators are gonna let us know where to go. And they are, in some cases, they are mandated on the right side of freeways and expressways, and on at least one side of the interchange ramps. So at these locations in particular, one more time, at the right side of the freeways and expressways, they are mandated, while they are optional elsewhere. Here now we're moving to the traffic signs. So we're done with traffic markings. Traffic signs now fall into one of the three major categories. The first one is regulatory signs, second is warning signs, and third is guide signs. And with that, we are going to continue the traffic signs and also the traffic signals in the next lecture. Thank you so much.